Well, welcome back, everyone, to this Diversity and Inclusion Marathon as part of the Victoria Forum. We certainly did not leave the easiest issues for last. The panel now will be looking at defining climate justice. It's a pleasure to welcome this great panel and to hand it over to Peter Robinson, former CEO of the David Suzuki Foundation. Over to you.
Thank you, Sebastian. Well, I'd like to start, like others have before me throughout the last day and a half, by acknowledging the Songhees and Esquimalt people and their welcoming us to this territory. So let me start there for a minute and say, heaven help us if that ever just becomes a statement that we make at the start of events and ceremonies. It must be more than that, and we should, when we say it, acknowledge that we understand what it means and that we'll take action. Okay, I'll introduce myself a bit here. There was a very late change to the agenda. David Miller, who was to moderate this panel, had to take off for a while, and at the very last moment, as in the last hour, both SYBIL and I were asked to step in and take his place. So he sends his sincere apologies. Hopefully he'll be back a little later on, but I'll be doing this particular panel on defining climate justice. And I am one of the two co-chairs for this particular theme, along with Dr. SYBIL SEITZINGER from PICS. And the two of us have decided that we'll step up and try to give you a much better sort of flavor of what we're trying to do and offer a compelling story about the way forward. So my bio is on the website, and as Sebastian said, what is relevant perhaps to this panel is that I was, for the last decade, the head of the David Suzuki Foundation. I would say, by the way, that of all the positions I've held over my career, that was the most challenging, demanding position I have ever held. And that's because David is demanding and challenging. And I'm sorry he's not here for him to hear me say that. But I don't want to start the introduction to this panel with talking about my last position. I want to talk about my first. In the 1970s and the early 1980s, at the very start of I was a teenager when I started, I was a park ranger, and I worked all over the province of British Columbia, from the terminal range of the Rocky Mountains, the northern Rocky Mountains, to the Cascade Mountains along the US border. And it was an unbelievably glorious career for a young man. I was outdoors every day in places of incredible beauty, and I learned much about ecosystems and natural processes and the importance of protecting and restoring the environment. It essentially grounded me in what is now my worldviews we've heard a little bit about over the course of this day. Now, the 1970s seem a long way away, 4 decades. And with all that we hear about climate change these days, we could be excused for thinking that this is a more recent conversation and a more recent debate and a more recent form of action. But for people who work close to the land or the sea, farmers, fishers, foresters, Indigenous people, and yes, park rangers, we have been aware that climate change has been happening for a very long time. In the mid-1970s, when I was working along the Alaska Highway, you could visibly see the impacts of climate change as permafrost came out of the soil and began to impact roads, rail lines, and structures. More dramatically, in the late 1970s, when I was the assistant superintendent at Manning Provincial Park, we witnessed the emergence of mountain pine beetle in the forests of British Columbia. Natural processes had long kept those insect populations under control. You need prolonged periods of minus 40 degrees Celsius for that to occur. And over the course of the 1970s, those prolonged periods essentially disappeared. We did not have them anymore. And so the mountain pine beetle exploded into our forests, and over the course of a couple of decades, essentially decimated the lodgepole pine forests in this province. So those of us who were working at the time, we could see what was going on. We could anticipate what was going to happen. But pinning this to global warming and taking actions to control the climate change was not given a priority at the time. So what happened next is, in fact, a very sad story that we know about, the virtual, as I said, decimation of the entire mature lodgepole pine forest in British Columbia, tons of dry debris on the grounds, explosive forest fires that have grown more severe year over year, whole communities that were deprived of timber and livelihoods, or the loss of homes and buildings due to fire. And now we are faced with examples of climate change all over the world: loss of Arctic ice, devastating storms, floods and droughts, rising sea levels, loss of biodiversity, and an increasing number of climate refugees around the world. It is tragic. It is unconscionable. We could have dealt with it, but failed to take action. And that is essentially the definition of climate justice. In the first place, a changing climate has and will cause enormous changes and devastate whole communities of people and other species. So failing to understand and mitigate climate change is a justice issue. And now we face both the urgent need to halt climate change and the fact that the impacts are essentially locked into the foreseeable future. We have to do so much more, and we have to approach the challenge with a sense that we can actually solve this, and that we'll need to both mitigate and adapt at the same time. And I think a useful metaphor for how climate justice should be included in our thinking is the comment from Lord Allardyce this morning when he talked about intractable conflicts. In dealing with issues of climate change on people, communities, indeed on all life, we should show respect for people and species impacted. They are not victims. It is not their fault. There would be fairness. The responsibility to help should be borne primarily by those who caused the problem, not those who are impacted. We must ensure that our political systems, democratic or otherwise, are able to resolve the injustices at a local and a global level. And this is clearly about relationships. Local communities, nations, the global community, all working together. So I'd like to introduce our panelists for this next session. Their bios, again, are available online and in your materials. They are Judith Sayers, who is an adjunct professor in the School of Environmental Studies here at UVic, and recently the president of the Nuu-chah-nulth Tribal Council. Dr. Michael BYERS, professor of global practices and international law at the University of British Columbia, and I've known Michael for quite a while and find his understanding of the connections, the interstitial connections for how these things fit together to be really quite extraordinary. And Dr. SYBIL SEITZINGER, the executive director of PICS, the Pacific Institute for Climate Solutions, and a professor at the School of Environmental Studies at UVic. I'm going to ask Judith to kick this off with some comments, and then Michael, and then we're going to turn to questions, and I'm hoping that over the course of the remainder of this session, we'll get a really good understanding of not just what it means to address climate change, but what are the solutions we have to begin to do right away. So over to you, Judith.
Thanks, Peter. It's great to be here today on the unceded territories of the Songhees and Esquimalt peoples, and to be here this afternoon with you to talk about such an important subject. You know, I was born and raised in Hupatusset territory, which is in Port Alberni, and I used to tease people that I had webbed feet, and I used to have an umbrella that I could just pour water on, and an umbrella would come out, because that was the climate we lived in. And lately, it's not like that. I go outside some mornings and I think, where is the rain? What has happened to our world? Things didn't seem the same. An increase in winds. Of course, I think a lot of that's the clear-cut logging on the mountains. You know, in my lifetime, I've seen a lot of change. And so have many people. And so we start talking about climate justice. And, you know, we ask that question, well, what is climate justice? And it's a struggle to secure global justice for those people vulnerable to the impacts of climate change who are usually forgotten. The poor, the disempowered, the marginalized across the world, including many Indigenous peoples. Climate justice is a term that frames global warming as an ethical and political issue, rather than one that is purely environmental or physical in nature. A fundamental proposition of climate justice is those who are least responsible for climate change suffer its gravest consequences. And, you know, I think that's true all over the world. And of course, we know that the vast majority of why we have climate change comes from developed countries or from the northern global countries. And so who really is most impacted? And, you know, those who live along the coast, those who are seeing water levels change. We see people in remote communities being challenged, but we also see people in large cities. What about the big fires in Kelowna? What about when California was burning? You know, it's affecting everybody, everywhere, but it seems to be those that are most impacted are those who can't afford it to recover from the impacts of climate change. Coastal communities are looking at rising water levels. I used to negotiate treaties on behalf of my community. And when we were doing land selection, I'd ask myself, I'd ask the negotiators, well, how far off the water do you think we should negotiate for waterfront property? Because we know by erosion, we know by rising water levels, this land isn't going to be waterfront, it's going to be underwater. Never got an answer, but it was something I was very conscious about doing. Not only are the waters rising, but the temperature of the water is increasing. And we see algae blooms all over the place. I was just out in Tofino a little while ago when I crossed to Mears Island, and the taxi driver was telling me how horrible it's been all summer because of all the algae blooms and how it's been blocking up their motors. And you know, these warmer water temperature means that the fish don't run. So we have large salmon runs that come up the Alberni Canal into the Somas River, and then they go up into Sprout Lake and Great Central and further to spawn. If the water hits 20 degrees, the fish pool up down in the inlet where it's cooler. They go deep, they stay in cool water, and eventually the water gets too hot and we have a lot of mortalities of fish. So that impacts us as First Nations being able to get enough food, but it also impacts commercial fisheries. It affects people's livelihoods. And, you know, what is it that we can do? What are we doing about it? Because it is a really big impact. A lot of the sea resources are what we depend upon to live. Snowpacks are shrinking, and they disappear faster. And there's predictions of, I can't remember how many years before they're gone. Can you imagine no snowpacks throughout the year? We do a Run of the River project in Port Alberni, and we've even noticed the runoff has decreased because of the snowpacks are melting faster and the water's just coming right through. But it's also those snowpacks that would cool down the waters so the fish would come up. Forest fires have become a huge issue in British Columbia. And I know the Chilcotin people are really suffering this winter because their forests got burned down. There's no deer, there's no moose. And that's what they live on through the winter. And their communities are scrambling to bring in beef. Not so appetizing when you're used to a diet of wild meat. And not only is that, but you know, we go out into the forests, we go into our cathedrals, and we gather medicinal plants. And those plants have been burnt up. Or the ecosystems have changed so much that they're not growing anymore. And you know, as global warming and we're moving further north, a lot of those ecosystems, you know, have moved. And you know, we're struggling to find the medicinal plants that we need, or the roots, or the grasses that we rely on for our artwork, for our medicinal purposes, for food, going out and gathering mushrooms. And it's when there's forest fires and when there's been climatic changes, our way of life has been altered to such a great degree that you wonder, how are we going to be able to continue to be what we are? We've looked at the forest industry. When the fires burn, when pine beetle attacks, huge impacts on jobs, on the economy. Forest fires can mean loss of electricity and internet. We only have to look to Puerto Rico and their loss of electricity. I can't imagine having to go so long without electricity and without help. I mean, that's a huge example of a community that's suffering, and there is no help for them. There's so many more impacts that we could go through in climate change and what is happening, but our world is inalterably changing, and we need to do what we can now. If we don't act now, we don't continue to act and be vigilant and be vocal, how we live is not going to be the same. And I know we all want this quality of life that we've always enjoyed. We want those pristine wildernesses. We want those beautiful rivers and oceans to enjoy. We need to mitigate those climate effects. And it's imperative that the world, and especially developed countries, shift to a low carbon economy as soon as possible. And there's many ways to do that, and people are doing it. We need to find money to bring in the low carbon innovations and implement them immediately. And we also need to have government regulations to help steer those kinds of innovations to be implemented. We need to do climate resilient activities. We need to develop and use renewable energy. We no longer need those huge dams. We don't need Site C. We don't need the impacts of a huge dam, and there's been dams all over the world that have impacted negatively along people. We need to do adaptation. We have to change the way we do things. We need to think about those forest fires. We need to be changing the roofing material. We need to be preparing for floods. We need to be preparing for fires. And how do we do that? We need take those actions, because that's one of the biggest issues I know with insurance companies is that you get a flood in your house and it might cost you $40,000 or more to fix it. And a lot of people can't afford that, and they're having to give up their homes. So we're entering into some real crisis types of situations that we need to deal with. We need to rely on community-led solutions. And with Indigenous peoples, let's use our Indigenous knowledge. We need to use local knowledge that is supported financially, politically, and in other ways by governments and NGOs. We need to give our communities a voice. They have a right to participate effectively at every level of decision-making, including needs assessment, planning, implementation, enforcement, and evaluation, the strict enforcement of principles of prior informed consent, and the right to say no. We have to recognize that those that are the most impacted are entitled to resources and technology to make the transition to a low carbon economy themselves, and do not have to continue to subject them to the severe poverty that they're in. So as they develop, they also need to be conscious to do low carbon activities. Climate justice must include restoring our ecosystems, protecting our ecosystems, managing them so that we can continue to have the ecosystems that impact and support our rights to hunt, fish, gather, trap, our rights for everyone to be out and enjoying the kinds of things that we had. I don't think we all want to be sitting here in 10 years and saying, oh yeah, we used to grow these amazing Douglas firs and they were huge. You could drive through Cathedral Grove and they'd be there, or these huge cedars that we'd build canoes and welcoming figures. That's not what we want to be telling our grandchildren. Those that have been impacted deserve full compensation, restoration, and reparation for the loss of land, livelihood, and other damages. We need a moratorium on new fossil fuel exploration and exploitation, a moratorium on the construction of nuclear power and phasing out nuclear power. And I've already mentioned the construction of large hydro schemes. Climate justice is committing to prevent the extinction of cultures and biodiversity due to climate change and its associated impacts. And like I said, I think a lot of us can already see some of those that have become extinct or are about to be extinct. So, you know, the poorest of the poor should not have to clean up after natural disasters and become poorer. They should not have to have the financial ability to clean up after these natural disasters. And climate justice isn't going to come from those big multinational corporations, the ones that have caused it. I don't know if there's a way we can find that they should be helping to pay for that, but they only want to create more money. We must have profound shifts from unsustainable production, consumption, and lifestyle, with industrial countries taking the lead. Climate justice affirms the rights of our future generations, those that are unborn. What are we going to be giving to them? We need to find climate justice. We need to find those solutions. And I know that because you're here today, we're all going to be part of that fight and that struggle to maintain our world. Thank you.
Thank you, Judith. So, Michael.
Well, thank you. I became aware of the climate crisis because of Indigenous knowledge. In 2004, I read a document called the Arctic Climate Impact Assessment. It was a research report, a deep research project commissioned by the 8 Arctic nation states, headed up by a climatologist from Harvard University named Bob Corral, who in his wisdom invited 28 Indigenous elders to be part of his science team. Inuit, Sami, Inupiat, Athabascan, Gwich'in, and they were full partners, along with hundreds of scientists, conventional scientists from around the world. And of course, they had the most profound insights because they had thousands of years of traditional knowledge concerning the snow and the ice and the permafrost and the ecosystems that rely upon that. It was a remarkable document that woke me up to the reality that something significant was happening. And after that, I traveled to the Arctic. I sailed through the Northwest Passage on Canada's research icebreaker, the Amundsen, with 40 scientists who were going through a deep crisis because they realized that what they were seeing in terms of melting ice exceeded the worst case models for climate change. And I've been engaged with this ever since. I had the privilege of heading up a big project called the Climate Justice Project for 6 years at UBC, trying to grapple with these issues, but always through the original perspective of traditional knowledge. So thank you. These are voices we need, not just to acknowledge, but to hear and to understand. And just to be clear, we are in a crisis. It is profound. I'm 51 years old, and during my lifetime, we have increased the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere by roughly 50%. We've lost 50% of the Arctic sea ice, that giant mirror that used to sit on top of the planet and reflect solar energy back into space. All of that solar energy is now going into the ocean, and it's altering weather patterns in places like Victoria, BC. I mean, we know all this. The scientific consensus is very strong. It's 97% among peer-reviewed climate science, which, gravity exceeds that in terms of consensus numbers, but not too much else. So it is serious, and it's desperate in all kinds of ways, including, and you didn't mention this, ocean acidification. Because all that additional carbon dioxide is finding its way into the oceans and essentially creating carbonic acid, changing the pH, which has profound consequences for mollusks in particular, for shelled creatures, but for the entire ecosystem. So we're on the brink of this precipice. And the bad news, because that's not the only bad news, the bad news is that we're not seeing the political will to take the decisive action now. For 2 years in this country, we've had a national government that actually understands the science and accepts the science, which is great. It's much better than what we had before. But this same government approved a pipeline to take bitumen to the west coast of BC to ship to China on the basis of an old environmental impact assessment process, the National Energy Board, that did not consider the downstream climate effects, which is very 20th century, right? They didn't have the political will to actually implement the science. And so if you're looking to politicians to solve this problem, there's considerable reason for despair. Now, I have some good news I want to share with you. In fact, it's really good news, I think. The first thing, and this has to go to a very particular aspect of climate justice, which is actually the courts. Justice is much more than the courts, but let me talk about courts for just a moment. And when I'm talking about courts and climate change, let me remind you that in the 1980s, the big tobacco companies were boasting that they had never lost a lawsuit, that they had never paid a settlement, and that they had no expectation that they ever would. This was in the 1980s, right? And if we were here in the 1980s, there might have been a cloud of cigarette smoke in this room. That's right. I mean, just think how we've changed that. And we changed it because, in large part, the courts and laws made with respect to the option, the availability of going to court. And I'll tell that story in a little bit more detail in a few minutes. But some really exciting things are happening with regards to climate litigation. The biggest problem with regards to climate litigation for decades has been establishing causation, right? So if you're an oil company, right, and you're emitting, you say to the court, well, no one can prove that I was actually responsible for the sea level rise. Or even if I am responsible for sea level rise, you can't quantify how much of the sea level rise is due to my emissions. And this was a big problem, establishing causation, because I cannot, as a legal system, impose costs on you unless it's clear that it's your fault. Well, the climate science is getting really good now. And so I can tell you with authority, based upon really good climate science, that Chevron has contributed 3.52% to global emissions since 1750. Okay, 3.52%. Exxon is just behind at 3.32%, right? So if the sea level rises by 1 meter, Chevron's responsible for 3.52 centimeters. And if the city of Richmond has to spend, what, $10 billion to build new heightened dikes to protect all that real estate and all those people, well, guess what? Chevron's responsible for 3.52% of that cost. We know that. That's climate science. And it's very rigorous, and it more than exceeds the burdens of evidence that are required by courts in the Western world. This is like really clearly over the bar. So that's one thing. Causation has changed because of climate science, and this is all fairly recent. The other thing two other things that are happening or are likely to happen, that are certain to happen as time passes. The one is that a lot of the attention on climate litigation focused on going to courts in the United States, right? Because that's where the big emitters are incorporated, right? You want to go after Exxon in the United States. And there were lawyers who were willing to do this work and are willing to do this work because they operate on the basis of contingency fees. Right? So if you're going to sue Chevron or Exxon for $1 trillion and you get a 20% contingency fee, you'll work for free as a lawyer. So a lot of the action happened so far in the United States. And people more or less forgot about some of the other options. And my work on this has been done in partnership with a remarkable lawyer based here in Victoria, based here in Victoria, named Andrew Gage, who works at West Coast Environmental Law. And Andrew had the insight, his insight, that Western legal systems, like the United States and Canada, quite regularly recognize and implement the judgments of foreign courts, right? So if you get a divorce settlement in England, right, you can enforce it in Canada through Canadian courts. Family law does this like every single day, the enforcement of foreign judgments. And the same is true in business law, enforcement of foreign judgments. If you have a breach of contract in Germany, you can go after the wrongful party here in Canada with a judgment from a German court to exercise that against assets located here. So enforcing foreign judgments as debts against assets located here. The United States does the exact same thing. So Andrew says, well, okay, so we get a judgment in a court in India, right, against Chevron for $10 billion. Well, that's enforceable in a US court or a Canadian court. India is a common law legal system, right? We accept them as equals. There's parity of judicial respect between those two countries. Absolutely. Give me an Indian judgment. I'll enforce it in a Canadian court. And guess what? Courts in India might actually be more open to climate litigation because there's not a big fossil fuel production industry in India. And there's an awful lot of climate damage happening right now. So enforcement of foreign judgments, watch this space. It's coming. If you're an investor in the oil sands, watch this wave of foreign judgments being enforced. That's part of it. The other, though, and this is where I really want to put my emphasis today, is that 17 years ago, in this province, in British Columbia, the Attorney General of the time, JUDITH, introduced legislation that was passed by the BC government on tobacco litigation and the recovery of health care costs. State of Florida did the same thing. But the BC legislation was a groundbreaker. And of course, the tobacco companies immediately challenged the legislation in court. In 2005, the Supreme Court of Canada upheld the legislation as constitutional. It said, yes, it is retroactive. But you tobacco companies, you were concealing the facts. You were telling people that tobacco does not cause health consequences. And we've now proven that wrong. So you're not only at fault for having marketed tobacco, you did so under false information. And you're responsible retroactively under this new law, which is entirely okay. You get the parallel here with the big fossil fuel companies, don't you? Right? Because they've been denying and funding deniers and trying to cloud the science for decades now. Exact same thing. And this has been working through, and the tobacco companies have been fighting this like crazy and spending hundreds of millions of dollars on legal fees, and they keep losing. And the province of BC is on the cusp of recovering somewhere in the range of $5 billion from the tobacco companies, which I hope will go into healthcare here in BC and not into general revenue. But that's happening right now. So why don't we do this with climate change, with climate damages? The science is now good enough, right? And what this legislation does is it doesn't make them legally responsible. It establishes what's called a cause of action. It removes some of the legal underbrush. It makes it very clear that this kind of case is considered, from the perspective of government and the perspective of legislation, to be something the court should allow if there is a plaintiff who has been wronged and there is evidence of damage, and you can quantify that and link it through causation to a defendant. It's just normal law. And the legislation makes this possible. No one has done this yet. State of Florida, state of California, they haven't done it yet. But it's clearly possible because we did it with tobacco. So what I'm really excited to report is that we can get justice, right? We have a new government here in BC that's led by the same party that JUDITH belonged to in 2000. We have clear and present and escalating climate damages coming, massive costs, billions of dollars. Why should we, the taxpayers, pay for damage caused by big fossil fuel companies, right? Why should we pay to build the dikes? Why should we pay to help the First Nations who can't access traditional food and have to import beef? And all the other costs that come with this. Why should we be paying to deal with the epidemic of pine beetles and all of the damage that they've caused? We know who's responsible, right? And they've been misleading us. And there's lots of legal precedent. This is just like tobacco. So let's go after them. Let's seize the day. That's not going to solve the climate crisis, but it will have one interesting consequence that I haven't spoken about yet. It will impose massive financial costs on the fossil fuel industry, which will reduce or eliminate a lot of their profits, and by so doing, reduce their competitive advantage vis-a-vis alternative energy sources. You want to level the playing field, right? You want to dial back production. You want to get more solar, more wind, more hydro. You want to make that transition. Make the fossil fuel industry pay for part of that and go after their profits, because you know what? Those profits were not properly earned, right? They were earned on the basis of misrepresentation, right? And on the basis of offloading costs onto future generations of people, including First Nations. And that's wrong. Now, lawyers are often open to criticism, and in many cases for good reason. But in this case, because of the lack of political will, the lawyers might just save the day. Thank you.
Okay, so we've heard from Judith about that call to action that's necessary, and we've heard from Michael about this issue of climate litigation and how it could be a game changer, I think is how you would define it. What I'd like to do now is ask a question of the panel, starting with SYBIL, and I'm going to be keeping an eye out to see if there's any questions, and if there are questions, I'm gonna stop and bring others into this, and I guess I have to look to these two microphones to see if that happens. But I want to just go to the first question, and this would be to expand our thinking beyond what we've already heard and say, are there examples of the application of climate justice thinking around the world that might otherwise expand our thinking around this issue in BC and Canada? And Sybil, I'd like you to kick this off.
Sure, thank you. And again, thank everyone for coming and staying for the day here. Yeah, I wanted to make a couple of points. One is that we're not alone in this issue, obviously, of climate change. It's something, as we've been hearing, that is happening around the world and that will continue to evolve in terms of its impacts and in terms of how individuals, how communities, how nations respond to that and prepare for the changing climate that we can't avoid. And so I think it's not only important to learn from each other, and I think to really build on that as we move forward, because we have to realize we're really at the beginning of this journey of climate change. We are in the very, very early stages of this. I mean, it is going to be unfolding over the next, not just decades, but hundreds of years. So it's something we have to learn from each other now and build the knowledge of how to both reduce our emissions, get them to zero greenhouse gas emissions, really. The climate scientists tell us by about 2070. So that's only about, what, 70 minus, let's say we're at 2020, because that's basically where we are, 50 years from now. So we have a major task ahead of us. And I'm a great believer in building global knowledge and sharing global knowledge. In my previous job, before being the director of the Pacific Institute for Climate Solutions, which I started just 2 years ago, I was the director of a very large international global environmental change network of scientists around the world. Around the world meaning not just from North America and Europe, but really from Asia, Africa, and throughout Latin America. And I really learned the power of learning from each other and really sharing knowledge. But what I wanted to do is give you an example which has come to light for me, and it deals with the Netherlands and how the Netherlands is addressing climate justice and through looking at risk. As you know, I think many of you know, the Netherlands is a country which is 25% of the land of the Netherlands is below sea level already, right? It mainly is built on reclaimed land from the sea. And they've built these massive dikes. They're known for their ingenuity in building these dikes to keep the sea out. Their history here of building these dikes, and they have to also constantly pump water out of the land back into the sea to keep the water level below the land surface that they do have. But what their policies have resulted in is, of course, keeping the sea out generally, but if there's a major storm surge, of course, the dikes can be, the water can go over the dikes or the land can be flooded. And this has resulted in basically an uneven distribution of risk across the country for actually loss of life if there was a major storm surge that broke through the dikes. So a very uneven distribution of risk, and basically you could think of it as climate justice or justice, not necessarily climate change per se, but right now, justice in terms of an uneven distribution of risk of individuals actually losing, dying from this major flood surges, major surges. But now they're looking forward, of course, with very big eyes open because of sea level rise, as has been alluded to here. Because not only do they have to deal with the current level of sea, but the rising sea level. And so they're looking to how to move forward with the management of these dikes. Are they have to be increased? How are they going to manage the pumping of water out of the landscape itself? And very forward-looking in this. And what as I understand it, their new flood management strategy is that they are working towards actually an even distribution of risk now across the country, so that by 2050, which isn't very long from now, by 2050, there will be an even distribution of risk throughout the whole country in terms of the risk of loss of life due to a storm surge. Okay. Now, it's not just an even risk across the country, but a very low risk as well. So very low risk and evenly distributed. And so I think the question here is, as we're developing as new policies, as new legislation is coming forward here in BC and Canada and wherever around the world, how should we be looking at risk and looking at not just looking certainly at the most vulnerable populations, right? But also looking at the risk to everyone and how do we engage and have our risk be low everywhere? It's a huge challenge. A huge challenge, but you think about a country that's already 25% below sea level that has made the commitment to having, basically I see this as a great example of climate justice for everyone in that country with respect to loss of life for storm surges. So I think we need to keep looking at examples around the world, and I think we need here in BC to be examples of how to address climate justice for everyone. And so I just wanted to put that forward, that we need to take a long-term view, make the decisions now, and to reduce the risk in a just way for everyone. And it can be done.
Michael, do you have an example from elsewhere in the world that you could think of that would also add to this?
On climate justice?
On the application of climate justice.
Well, the Climate Justice Project that I co-directed with Mark Lee at the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives focused on British Columbia as a case study for a global issue. And our principal lens was to look at inequitable degrees of risk and exposure to consequences. So the simple analogy is that the 1% is going to do not so badly over the next 30 or 40 years because they can afford to move from Richmond up to West Vancouver get away from sea level. They can afford to pay more for food because food is going to become more expensive because there will be more droughts in the world. There'll be less food security, but that's okay. They'll be able to import their avocados from New Zealand instead of from California, right? The 1% is going to be just fine. It's the people who are in a low-income group who will be most severely impacted. Globally, it's going to be people of color in the global south and in the far north. It's going to be women and children. It's going to be low-income people in precarious employment. It's going to be refugees and migrants of all kinds. We know that in BC. It's going to be people in lower incomes who will again, be unable to pay for food. We'll see the costs of heating and electricity go up, who will have to deal with lots of housing pressures because we're going to have waves of climate refugees entering the country. Government services are going to get stretched. Where do you put your money? Do you help Richmond build the dikes and save Richmond, or do you put that money into drug abuse prevention and low-income housing? Governments need to make choices. Climate change is going to limit those choices, or actually force more dramatic choices than we have right now. And it goes on and on and on. Nicholas Stern, who was the chief economist for the World Bank a decade ago, estimated, one of the world's leading economists, that every dollar put into climate change prevention in 2007 would save $20 of government expenditure in 2050. Now, there have been another 10 years on this. So I agree that we need to adapt, but unless we can actually turn off this tap of carbon dioxide and methane, right, governments will not be able to deal with this. We will get a collapse of government ability to deliver services. This will fray our society. It will cause social breakdown at some point. It's not a future anyone wants to contemplate. So the real answer, Peter, is that it's all hands on deck. This is a global emergency. We need to get our emissions down immediately. And it just so happens that we're here in BC in one of the best places on earth to do this, right? We have a major expansion of a bitumen pipeline that is planned, that is going to take some of the world's dirtiest oil to China to burn, to create more climate change. And we have millions of people here who are going to stop that, right? Regardless of what the federal government might say. We're going to stop that because we have to, because there will be no future if we don't, right? We have a carbon tax. Thank you, Gordon Campbell. It was visionary. It set a model for the world, but we need to support the current provincial government to ratchet that up and to keep going, right? Because we need to go higher on that. We need to internalize those externalities, and we need to do it fast. And we need to support transitions in terms of energy in a very quick way. Solar panels on roofs, right? Take all the money we're going to save from Site C and put it into retrofitting every building in BC and putting solar panels on top and create a whole bunch of jobs. This takes real political will. It takes real decision making, and it's right now. And then do something bold, like I've just said, and lead the world and introduce a climate damages litigation act and go after those big fossil fuel companies that have made trillions of dollars on our backs and make them pay for what they've done. Well.
Now, Judith, actually, I'm just checking, are the folks that are down there in the corner asking questions, or is this just a comfortable chair for you? Or is there a question that's, do any of you want to ask a question before I ask Judith one here?
There's a question over here.
Okay, well, just let me finish with, I know there's at least a question.
Okay.
So if you want to make your way down to the mic, that would be great. Judith, what about you from the Indigenous world? Are there other examples of the application of climate justice that you are aware of to actually help in the resolution of this intractable problem we face?
I haven't heard of many in the Indigenous world of what's happening with climate justice. Trying to recover after a fire, after a fire or flooding, and there isn't money there to help them recover and just puts them deeper into poverty. A lot of First Nations would really love to be involved in clean and renewable energy, but Site C is stopping any more development of clean energy. And you look around the world and you see how so many countries have embraced renewable energies and how that's helping to reduce greenhouse gases. And, you know, that's in hot climates, cold climates, wherever. But one of the initiatives that would be great to kind of duplicate is renewable cities. And Vancouver is one of them, you know, and they're amazing what they're trying to do, the goals that they've set, you know, and people may not like the bike lanes, but if it's taking cars off the road and reducing greenhouse gases, more power to them. There's, you know, real vision. You know, we talk about some of these renewable cities, and they're talking about planning water for 100 years. You know, water is going to be one of the main issues that we are going to suffer from with climate change. If temperatures keep going up, if drought gets more severe, some countries are already in dire straits for money. And how are we handling that here? I know we were trying to ensure that our water couldn't be exported through NAFTA and other treaties. And, you know, as First Nation people, we believe we own the water. We have Aboriginal title to the water. And I think that we always told the federal governments at the table is that, you know, that's going to help you. You know, if the U.S. comes and tries to take the water, you can say, well, that doesn't belong to us. It belongs to the Aboriginal people. But we share it with them, you know. And people may not like that concept. But, you know, how do we stop other countries from coming and taking our water? So I think some of those things that we have to consciously, as we're developing, is being sustainable and to continue to look at those principles. I forgot to mention one example. I really want to mention it quickly, is that they just opened a huge $300 million highway from Tuktoyaktuk into UVic. And is that a solution? Did they talk to the Indigenous people? Did they talk to the communities? $300 million that could have gone into other climate solutions, because there's examples of other highways that have been built in the north where the permafrost just destabilizes them and you can't even use the highway anymore. And are we making solutions for people that aren't going to work, that are being impacted by climate change? And I think we have to be really careful when we try and find solutions for, you know, Indigenous communities, for other communities, that we're doing the right thing. And that we do it with everybody's input and knowledge. And so we're not just trying to do something for them, that, you know, the paternalistic attitude that we've always had from the federal government.
Right. All right, I see people lined up now, and we've got about 10 to 15 minutes left. So I can see several people at each mic. So we'll start here and we'll alternate. Just ask, say who you are and ask a question of either one panelist or two. And panelists, I want to make sure we get about 6 people now, so keep your answers really quite concise. So we'll start right here.
Hi, my name is Zain Abbas, and I'm a student at Roroth University. And my question is to Dr. Michael BYERS. And you touched upon global enforcement mechanisms regarding climate change and the goals we set for ourselves, and how courts have important role to play. And my question is, we see that a lot of nations get together, for example, in Paris, and they set goals for themselves. They have targets like you have to bring it down to 2 degrees by 2100 to make sure that we are able to sustain in the long run, to make sure that we have the planet to ourselves. But at the same time, there is no global policing around it because there's a matter of sovereignty. There are nations, and sometimes to tackle that, they pose like sanctions on certain countries. But when countries like US pull out, you can't do anything about it. So, and the courts, I have a specific example of Chevron Texaco in Ecuador, where they dumped 18.5 million toxic water into indigenous communities, and how it destroyed their lands there. And then they go to courts in US, and US says it's not in their jurisdiction because it happened in Ecuador. They go to Ecuador, and they get the judgment there. It's not like $9 billion or $16 billion, like in lieu of payments. So Chevron was ordered to pay. So Chevron goes back to US, And the court there says that it does not apply because there's like prominence of bribery and corruption in Ecuadorian court system. So therefore, this decision is null and void. So how do you go about like tackling these kind of issues? And another thing is you talked about causation, and we talk about like these fossil fuel energies, but I don't see people talking about lifestyle farming, which is the biggest contributor towards greenhouse gases and everything. So what do you say about that?
Question.
It's great to have a question from someone as knowledgeable as you are. You know these issues very well. And I'll address the points very quickly. When governments make promises at big climate change conferences, they might not intend to keep them, but they're still making promises, which gives leverage against them for citizens, for activists, and yes, through the courts. So a Dutch citizen a couple of years ago took the Dutch government to court saying that they weren't upholding their public commitments to reduce climate emissions. And he actually got a court order saying, Dutch government, you need to accelerate your emission reductions by an additional 20% because you breached your public commitment. Now, that was under Dutch law. It might not be available in all countries. But you see, when they make these promises, when they say 2%, they might not intend to keep that promise, but boy, do we then have a stick to beat them with, right? And don't forget that. So when the Trudeau government came in, they went off to Paris, they made all sorts of great promises, and I'm thinking, okay, we're going to make you stick to these, right? And we'll find ways to put pressure. The other thing to say, it's always difficult to enforce foreign judgments, and it depends a lot on what happened in the courts of the originating country. So every case is unique. And that case from Ecuador was not a good set of facts to actually test this avenue. But there are lots and lots of cases where we've had positive effects in terms of the enforcement of foreign judgments. And another additional point, you don't even necessarily need to win at the end to get the big collection of money. You just cost the fossil fuel companies billions and billions in terms of legal fees to fight these cases, and all of the negative reputation that comes from fighting against something like climate justice in courts. These things hurt. Reputations matter for companies. So this is just a way to cause a big stink, and yes, potentially get big damage awards. There's other stuff to talk about, but thank you.
Yeah. And I do want to get to some of these other questions. So again, briefly introduce who you are and briefly say what your question is and direct it maybe to one of the panelists.
Mike.
Hey, hi, my name is Jamila and I am a biology student here at UVic. And the reason of my questions, you've answered a bit of it, but I have a lot of friends and a lot of people in biology as well who are interested in climate justice, but it feels as if we don't have the power to actually make a change. And it also, from hearing this, I feel as if there are many companies who are actually in charge of what is happening with the climate and carbon emissions. In a way, like if we make a decision to stop buying meat, then meat is still being produced and there's still being clear cuts and more cows and things like that. Or if we decide to not drive cars, then there is still many cars being produced and there's still carbon emissions, and it has nothing to do with us, but with bigger companies. So my question is, and I know you've touched a bit about it, what are things that we could do as, let's say, young citizens to actually have some say in climate justice and maybe have something happen so we could have like a bigger impact? And also, how could we, if you've seen any other cases in different countries where things have happened, where people have been empowered and things have actually happened and it has worked? Thank you.
Wow, thank you. So Judith, I'm going to let you deal with this because you've done the call to action piece, and keep an eye on this clock ticking down here so we can get to the others. But if you want to address that. I'm very conscious of this clock.
I think there's actions that can be taken personally, in the way we live our life, switching to EVs, to activities where we're not creating as much greenhouse gases, traveling in carbon credit type of transportation. And then I think we need to be a voice out there and suggesting actions by government and making this a reality for everybody out there. I think everybody knows now that climate change is real, but I don't think they know what to do. And I think that's where we can help, is to, get people to have an individual action plan, to push the federal government into the commitments they made in Paris and then are making in Germany today. Those kinds of things that, we just, especially young people, I think, because it's your future that is at stake. You're going to be living with greater impacts of climate change if we don't do it. So those are some of the things I think you need to personally change your life, get political change and political commitment, and just educate everybody, especially the younger generation that's coming up.
We find that activism and litigation go hand in hand, so I think that's an important point. Okay, over to this side.
Hi, this question is for Dr. Byers. So when you were talking about kind of the success of the fight against the tobacco companies as a method of not offloading costs on future generations, I couldn't help but think about how some of these companies are so present in some developing countries that don't have the same regulatory standards, and also might not have as developed of a litigation system that we would engage in them the way that you're saying. So I was wondering, in your scheme, the proposed kind of strategy that you're talking about, how do we ensure that we're not offloading the costs of emissions on other developing countries?
That's a great question, and litigation is not a panacea. It doesn't solve the climate problem on its own. It's just one of the many tools in the toolbox. And so yes, the tobacco industry is doing really well in China and Africa and elsewhere. But climate is different in other respects, right? So China is leading the world in terms of solar panel production, right? We have an advantage with regards to climate change that we didn't have with regards to lung cancer, right? And that is that you can make tons of money solving climate change, right? You can't make tons of money stopping lung cancer from happening by stopping people from smoking. So the package of tools is actually larger here. And I worry that in Canada, we'll just sort of stumble along behind the pack as countries like China move through this industrial revolution, right, and become leaders in alternative energy production, and we'll still be subsidizing the oil sands and building pipelines, right? But what I'm saying about the legal system is that there are easy ways to make it possible to cause a lot of anxiety in fossil fuel company head offices about litigation exposure. And you start waving around the numbers here, right? 3.52% of climate change damages worldwide. That's a climate liability that Chevron is carrying. Let's amplify that. Let's tell the world, because no one should be investing in Chevron because they've got this massive debt hanging over them, and a million lawyers around the world who would love to work on cases against them, because lawyers can be activists too. So that's the simple answer, is that we can actually solve this problem. We need to make sure our politicians hear that inaction is completely unacceptable and partial action is not nearly enough. But we also need to explore every single other avenue. It's all hands on deck, right? If we don't do this in the next 10 years, it's over. Right? I mean, human civilization and a lot of other stuff is over. That's how serious it is. So let's man the barricades. Let's get this done.
Well, we have time for one more question, then I'm going to wrap this up. And I'll take this one over here.
Hello, everyone. My name is Rehan Said, and I'm a fourth-year anthropology student here at UVic. Thank you very much, everyone. And my question is directed to Dr. Michaels. Very much because you said you are open to criticism. So I do agree with your solution that you propose, that how about this concept of, monetary reparation and fiscal compensation provided to the one who is impacted.
Can you pull that closer to your...
I do agree with your idea of providing monetary compensation and, fiscal reparation to those people who are impacted by, from the corporate perpetrators. But the underlying issue that I see is that what we are doing in turn is that we are corporatizing this very fundamental institution of justice and judicial system. What I see is that it is not it obviously has a potential of solving the problem for like a temporary regime, but in long term I see it's just like starting another episode of Tom and Jerry, where like it's a battle between corporate and the judicial system, where one would obviously earn more and more income, and the judicial system would charge and fine them more and more. So I don't see it solving a problem. Rather, I see it's just exacerbating the problem.
Well, I'll simply answer that by referring you to a couple of historical examples where the courts have actually provided justice to marginalized people. Think about Aboriginal rights litigation here in BC, from the Calder case onwards to the Chilcotin case, right? The courts, not the politicians, right? Not the public. The courts were the ones who recognized Aboriginal rights and gave our First Nations power with regards to governments through the law. Think of the civil rights movement in the United States, right? Where would African Americans be without the Supreme Court of the United States of America in that fight? Yeah, you can make a lot of criticisms of the legal system, and most of the judges are very rich, old, white guys who have a different view of justice than you do. But they are a tool that can be used. And in the circumstances we are globally right now with climate change, we need every single tool. So let's use the courts and let's use every other tool available to try to turn this catastrophe around. We might not agree on everything, and I suspect we don't, but we both want the same solution, right? We want to turn this around. So I'll talk with the lawyers, you talk with your people, we'll come at them from different angles, and we'll win this fight.
Wow. Well, there's a good ending. I want to thank everybody for sticking through this panel here, and the panelists themselves for putting on that effort to do a couple of things. And in wrapping up, I'll just say, I hope you come away with a kind of a new perspective on climate justice. You would have heard from the panelists about the urgency and awareness of what's going on. And as Judith says, the impacts, the justice impacts are primarily on those who are least able to deal with them themselves. This firm call to action, as Michael sort of reinforced over and over again, there's all hands on deck. They need everything we can to deal with this. And I hope you also take away this notion that climate mitigation, in other words, stopping climate change, is in fact the essence of addressing climate justice. And adaptation is merely a consequence of our failure to address this in the first place. So thank you very much for coming.
And thank you, Peter and SYBIL, for putting together a great panel. In 15 minutes, we reconvene on global trade, inclusive economies, and a progressive trade agenda. And we'll hear not only from a great set of panelists, but also somebody from Ottawa, the trade negotiator for Canada, will be intervening by video link from Ottawa. So see you in 15.